If you've ever looked at a stranger and felt something you couldn't explain, a pull, a familiarity, a whisper in your chest that said, "I know you," then this story is going to hit you harder than you expect. 40 years apart, two different families, two different cities, two women who never knew each other existed. But when Judge Nkechi Okafor looked across the courtroom and saw the defendant's attorney, a woman with the same birthmark, the same jawline, the same hands, she felt the floor shift beneath her chair. She didn't know why. Not yet. But her hands started shaking. And they didn't stop for 3 days. Hey there, welcome back. Before this story begins, do us a favor. Like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. Drop your country in the comments below. Are you watching from Canada, Johannesburg, maybe Jamaica or Houston? We'd love to know. Now, let me take you back. Back 40 years. To a hospital in a city called Franklin. Franklin General Hospital, 3rd floor, maternity ward, room 309. A Tuesday in February, cold outside, the kind of cold that makes the windows fog up from the inside, and the radiators clank like someone is banging pipes with a wrench. The room was small, one bed, one chair, a curtain that separated nothing from nothing because there was no one on the other side. A woman lay in that bed. Her name was Adana. Just Adana. She gave no last name when she checked in, and the nurse at the front desk wrote Doe on the intake form because the form required something in that box, and Adana had nothing to give. She was 22 years old. She was thin, too thin for a woman about to deliver, with dark brown skin and deep-set eyes that looked like they had already seen the end of something and were just waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Her hair was wrapped in a cloth, faded orange, knotted at the back. She wore a hospital gown and nothing else. No ring, no bracelet, no necklace. No identification of any kind. She was alone. No partner at her side. No mother holding her hand. No sister whispering encouragements. Just Adana and the nurse and the radiator clanking and the fog on the window and whatever was happening inside her body that she could not stop. She delivered twins, 2 girls, born 7 minutes apart. The first one came screaming, a loud, furious cry, the kind that sounds like a protest against being pulled from the warm dark into the cold light. The nurse said, "This one's got opinions." The second one came quiet, not silent. She breathed, she moved, she was healthy, but quiet. She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling and seemed to be thinking about something. Both girls were small but strong, 5 pounds each, dark brown skin like their mother. And on the inside of each girl's left wrist, a birthmark. A small dark patch shaped like nothing in particular. Not a heart, not a star, just a mark. The kind that a doctor would call a cafe au lait spot and a grandmother would call a kiss from God. The same mark, same wrist, same shape. Mirror images, like a signature written twice. Adana held them, one in each arm. She looked at their faces for a long time. The screaming one had fallen asleep. The quiet one was still looking at the ceiling. Adana's lips moved. The nurse, who was filling out paperwork across the room, couldn't hear what she said. But she saw Adana's mouth form 2 words, the same 2 words, whispered to each baby in turn. Then Adana set them down. She lay back against the pillow. She closed her eyes. And sometime in the early hours of Wednesday morning, while the nurses changed shifts and the radiator clanked and the February cold pressed against the fogged windows, Adana left. She walked out of Franklin General Hospital in her orange head wrap and no shoes, and disappeared into the city like smoke dissolving into air. She left nothing behind except 2 baby girls in room 309, with matching birthmarks and no names. But what happened next changed everything. Not in a day. In 40 years. The hospital called social services. A woman named Mrs. Edith Callahan, 54 years old, stout, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and a filing system that existed entirely inside her head, arrived at 8 in the morning. She looked at the twins. She checked the intake form. Adana Doe. No address, no phone, no emergency contact, no insurance, nothing. Mrs. Callahan made a decision that morning that would shape 2 lives without either life ever knowing it. She separated the twins. Not out of cruelty, out of math. The foster system in Franklin County was overloaded. There were not enough homes for single infants, let alone pairs. Mrs. Callahan called every family on her list. She found 2 homes willing to take a newborn, but neither could take 2. One family was in Franklin. The other was in a town called Briarwood, 90 miles east. 90 miles. Close enough to drive in an afternoon, far enough to become a different world. The screaming baby, the one with opinions, went to Franklin. She was placed with a couple named Harold and June Patterson. Harold was a bus driver, 51 years old, with large hands and a slow way of talking that made everything he said sound important. June was 48, a retired elementary school teacher who had wanted children her whole life and whose body had said no every time she asked. They lived in a brick duplex on Orchard Street with a backyard just big enough for a swing set and a vegetable garden. June held the baby for the first time, and the baby screamed, and June laughed and said, "Oh, you're going to keep me busy." They named her Nkechi. June had a book of African names. She had bought it at a used bookstore years ago, hoping, and she chose Nkechi because it meant God's gift. Harold said, "That's a big name for a small baby." June said, "She'll grow into it." The quiet baby went to Briarwood. She was placed with a single woman named Colleen Ferris. Colleen was 36, a paralegal at a small law office, living alone in a rented house on Elm Street with a cat named Biscuit and a shelf full of mystery novels. She'd fostered 3 children before, but never adopted. She hadn't planned on adopting this one either. But the quiet baby looked at her with those deep-set eyes, Adonna's eyes, and Colleen felt something lock into place inside her chest, like a key turning in a door she didn't know was there. She named her Zara. She didn't have a book of names. She just liked the sound of it. She said it meant princess in some language she couldn't remember. She later found out it meant flower in another language. She said, "Either way, it fits." And that was only the beginning. Nkechi and Zara grew up 90 miles apart. They breathed the same state's air. They looked at the same state's sky. They shared the same blood, the same birthmark, the same mother who had vanished into February cold. And they knew nothing of each other. Nkechi grew up loud, not obnoxious, alive. She had a voice that filled whatever room she was in, not because she was trying to fill it, but because her voice was built that way, the same way some instruments are built to carry. She talked early. She walked early. She argued with Harold about bedtime by age 4, presenting what June called closing arguments from the top of the stairs. June would look at Harold and say, "She's either going to be a lawyer or a dictator." Harold would say, "What's the difference?" And June would swat him with a dish towel. Nkechi was smart. Sharp smart. The kind that cuts through a question before you finish asking it. She read at 3. She was doing long division at 7. Her teachers at the public school on Orchard Street said she was the brightest student they had seen in years, and they said it with a mixture of admiration and exhaustion because Nkechi also questioned everything. She questioned the math. She questioned the history. She questioned why the cafeteria served the same soggy pizza every Friday when clearly there were better options. Her 5th-grade teacher, Mr. Hodges, said, "That child doesn't accept an answer. She cross-examines it." She was also kind. That is important. She was loud and sharp and restless, but underneath all of it, she was kind. She noticed when other kids were alone at lunch and sat with them. She gave away her snacks to a boy named Deshaun who never had any. She helped June in the garden every Saturday morning, pulling weeds with her small hands, and when she found a worm, she would carry it carefully to the other side of the yard and say, "Go live your life, little guy." Harold died when Nkechi was 12. Heart attack. In the middle of driving his bus route. He managed to pull over and open the doors before he went. His last act was making sure the passengers could get off safely. The bus company sent a card. June kept it on the refrigerator for the rest of her life. Nkechi stood at Harold's funeral in a black dress June had bought her the day before, and she didn't cry. Not because she wasn't sad, because she was so sad that crying felt too small for what she was feeling. She stood there with her jaw set and her hands at her sides and her deep-set eyes, Adana's eyes, looking at the casket like she was arguing with death itself, presenting closing arguments from beside a grave. June raised her alone after that, just the two of them in the brick duplex. June went back to substitute teaching to make ends meet. Nkechi got a job at 15, bagging groceries at the store on Main Street. She saved every dollar. She taped them inside a notebook she kept under her mattress. The notebook said law school on the cover in permanent marker. Because Nkechi had decided she was going to be a judge. Not a lawyer, a judge. She wanted to be the person who decided, the person who sat at the highest seat in the room and said, "This is what's fair." She had known this since she was 8 years old, the day June took her to the courthouse to pay a parking ticket, and Nkechi saw a woman in a black robe sitting behind a raised bench, and she tugged June's sleeve and whispered, "I want to do that." Now let me tell you about Zara. Zara grew up quiet. Not shy, present. She listened more than she talked, watched more than she moved, and absorbed the world the way dry earth absorbs rain. Deeply, silently, completely. Colleen used to say, "That child hears everything, even the things you don't say out loud." Zara was gentle with animals. She fed Biscuit the cat every morning and talked to him in a low voice while she poured the kibble, telling him about her dreams from the night before. Biscuit, who was not a friendly cat, who was, in fact, a cat of strong opinions and minimal patience, would sit and listen to Zara with his eyes half closed, which Colleen said was the cat equivalent of a standing ovation. Zara was smart, too. Differently smart than her sister she didn't know she had. Zara's intelligence was lateral. She saw around corners. She saw connections between things that other people didn't realize were connected. In school, when the teacher asked a question, Zara wouldn't give the expected answer. She'd give a better one that came from a direction nobody anticipated. Her 7th grade English teacher, Mrs. Rourke, wrote on a report card, "Zara doesn't think outside the box. She sees a box nobody else noticed and opens it." Zara found the law the way quiet people find loud things. By accident. Colleen was a paralegal, and she brought work home most evenings. Case files, transcripts, research briefs. She spread them across the kitchen table and worked until midnight. Zara, who was 11, started reading the files when Colleen wasn't looking. Not the simple ones, the complicated ones. The cases with conflicting evidence and ambiguous witnesses and legal arguments that twisted back on themselves. She found them fascinating the way other children found puzzles fascinating. She would sit at the kitchen table after Colleen went to bed and read by the light of the stove hood and try to figure out who was telling the truth. By 16, she knew she wanted to be a defense attorney. Not because she wanted to defend guilty people, because she understood, from reading hundreds of Colleen's case files, that the line between guilty and innocent was thinner than most people wanted to believe. That sometimes the person who looked guilty was just the person who couldn't afford to look innocent. That the system was a machine, and machines don't have hearts, and somebody needed to stand in the machine and be the heart. Colleen encouraged her. She gave Zara her old law textbooks. She let her sit in on depositions when the partners weren't looking. She drove her to the county courthouse on take your daughter to work days and introduced her to the attorneys and the clerks and the one judge who was kind enough to let a 16-year-old sit in on a hearing and watch justice, or something shaped like justice, unfold in real time. Now here is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Nkechi went to law school, graduated near the top, clerked for a federal judge, joined the district attorney's office, made a name, got appointed to the bench at 36, youngest judge in the county. She sat behind the raised bench in a black robe and thought about the day she was 8 years old and tugged June's sleeve and said, "I want to do that." Zara went to law school in a different state, graduated top of her class, joined a public defender's office, worked 70-hour weeks for $38,000 a year, took the cases nobody wanted, the messy ones, the heartbreaking ones, the ones where the system had already decided, and Zara had to convince it to look again. She built a reputation. Not loud, she was never loud, but steady. Attorneys who went against her in court said the same thing. She's quiet until she isn't, and then you lose. At 38, Zara moved to Franklin, a bigger office, more resources, better cases. She rented an apartment on the west side of the city. She walked to work. She ate lunch alone at a diner near the courthouse. She didn't know that the courthouse she walked past every day was the same courthouse where her sister sat behind the bench. She didn't know her sister existed. Nkechi didn't know either. She lived on the east side of Franklin, in the same brick duplex on Orchard Street, with June, who was 88 now, and still reading the newspaper every morning with her glasses on the beaded chain, and her opinions about everything delivered with the certainty of a woman who had survived enough to be sure. June's hands shook now. Her memory drifted sometimes. But she still called Nkechi my gift, and she still kept Harold's bus company card on the refrigerator. For 2 years, Nkechi and Zara moved through the same city. They shopped at the same grocery store on different days. They walked the same courthouse hallways at different hours. They breathed the same city air. They carried the same birthmark on the inside of their left wrists. And the city kept them apart the way cities keep millions of people apart, with schedules and routines and the sheer mathematical improbability of two specific people finding each other in a sea of everyone else. Until a Tuesday in October. But what neither of them knew yet was that a single case would bring them face to face. The case was called State versus Margaret Hollis. Margaret Hollis was 61 years old, a retired school teacher charged with embezzlement. She had worked at a charter school for 23 years and was accused of diverting $42,000 from the school's scholarship fund into a personal account. The prosecution said it was theft. The defense said it was more complicated than that. Zara was assigned the case. She read the file the way she always read files, slowly, laterally, looking for the box nobody else had noticed. She visited Margaret in the county detention center. Margaret was a small woman with steel gray hair and trembling hands, and a face that looked like it had been crying for so long that the tears had carved permanent channels in her skin. She told Zara the truth, or what she said was the truth, that the money had gone to students, directly to students who needed rent help, grocery money, medical bills, students who came to Margaret because the scholarship fund was out of money, and the school wouldn't replenish it, and the students would drop out without help, and Margaret could not watch one more child drop out. So she moved the money herself. She kept records, handwritten, in a notebook, with every student's name and every dollar noted. But she moved it outside the official system because the official system had said no. Zara looked at the notebook. She looked at the names. She looked at Margaret's trembling hands. She said, "I'll take the case." The trial was assigned to Judge Nkechi Okafor's courtroom, Division 3, 3rd floor. The morning of the first hearing, Zara walked into the courtroom carrying her case file and her brown briefcase. Not leather, just brown. The kind you buy at an office supply store and carry until the handle wears through. She was wearing a dark suit, her hair pulled back, her expression calm and focused. She walked to the defense table and set down her file and looked up at the bench. The bench was empty. The judge hadn't entered yet. Zara arranged her papers. The prosecutor, a man named David Kuhn, 45, experienced, methodical, sat across the aisle and nodded at her. The gallery had a few observers. Margaret sat beside Zara, her gray hair combed, her hands in her lap. The bailiff said, "All rise." The door behind the bench opened. Judge Nkechi Okafor entered in her black robe, her back straight, her deep-set eyes sweeping the room the way they always did. Left to right, assessing, counting, reading. She sat down. She opened the case file. She said, "Good morning. State versus Hollis. Is the prosecution ready?" David Kuhn stood. "Ready, Your Honor." Nkechi said, "Defense?" Zara stood. She said, "Ready, Your Honor." Nkechi looked at her and stopped. "Stay with us, because what happened next will shock you." It wasn't the face exactly. Nkechi had seen thousands of faces from the bench. It wasn't the voice, though Zara's voice had a quality Nkechi couldn't name. A depth, a texture, something that sounded like hearing your own thoughts spoken aloud by someone else. It was the hands. Zara was holding a pen in her left hand, and when she set it down on the table, the inside of her wrist turned upward for just a moment. And there it was. A small, dark mark. A cafe au lait spot, shaped like nothing in particular. Nkechi's left hand went to her own wrist, involuntarily. A reflex she didn't understand. She touched her own mark, the one she had carried since birth, the one June used to kiss every night and call your special spot. Her hands started shaking. She pressed them flat on the bench. She said, "Thank you, counselor. Please be seated." Zara sat down. She hadn't noticed anything unusual. She was focused on her case, her client, her opening strategy. She didn't see the judge's hands press flat against the surface. She didn't see the color shift in the judge's face. She didn't see the way Nkechi's eyes stayed on her for 3 seconds longer than protocol allowed. Nkechi ran the hearing. She was professional. She was precise. She scheduled the trial for 3 weeks out. She dismissed the courtroom. She went to her chambers. She closed the door. And she sat in her chair and looked at the birthmark on her left wrist and tried to understand why a defense attorney she had never met before made her feel like she was looking into a mirror that was somehow 40 years deep. For 3 days, Nkechi's hands shook. Not visibly, she hid it from the courtroom, from her clerks, from June. But at home, alone, she sat at the kitchen table and held her own hands together and felt a tremor running through them like a current. She did something she rarely did. She searched. Not online, she searched her own records. She went to the attic of the duplex and opened a box she hadn't opened in years. A box June had kept. Inside were documents from the adoption, the original placement papers, a letter from Mrs. Callahan, and a birth certificate. Or rather, a partial birth certificate. It listed the mother as Adana Doe. It listed the hospital as Franklin General. It listed the date, February 14th. It listed the time, 2:17 a.m. It listed one detail Nkechi had never paid attention to before, printed in small type at the bottom of the form. Birth order, 1 of 2. 1 of 2. Nkechi read that line 7 times. She went downstairs. June was in the living room, reading the newspaper with her glasses on. Nkechi sat down across from her and said, "Mama, am I a twin?" June set down the newspaper. She took off her glasses. She held them in her lap. Her hands were shaking too, but June's hands always shook now. She looked at her daughter, and the air in the room went thin, the way air goes thin at great heights. She said, "Yes." And just when you thought this was a courtroom story, it became a family story. June told Nkechi everything she knew, which was not much. Mrs. Callahan had told her there was a second baby, a girl, placed separately. June had asked where. Mrs. Callahan said she couldn't share that information. June had asked if they could adopt both. Mrs. Callahan said the other placement was already finalized. June had cried. Harold had held her. And then they took Nkechi home and raised her and loved her, and June kept the birth certificate in the box in the attic and waited for the day Nkechi would ask. She waited 40 years, and here it was. Nkechi said, "Why didn't you tell me?" June reached across and took Nkechi's hand. Her bent, shaking fingers wrapped around her daughter's strong ones. She said, "Because I didn't know how to give you something I couldn't finish. I didn't know where she was. I didn't know her name. I didn't know if she was alive. How do you tell a child they have a sister and then say, 'But I can't find her'?" That felt worse than not telling. Nkechi held June's hand. She didn't argue. She understood the math of love, the calculations mothers make when every option hurts, and you choose the one that hurts least and carry the rest yourself. She said, "I think she's in my courtroom." June went very still. She said, "What?" Nkechi described Zara, the quiet voice, the deep-set eyes, the left hand, the birthmark. June listened with her mouth slightly open. When Nkechi finished, June said, "How do you know it's her?" Nkechi said, "I don't know. I feel it, the way you feel a storm before it arrives." June was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" Nkechi said, "I'm going to find out." But the biggest secret hadn't come out yet. Nkechi recused herself from the case. She didn't explain why publicly. She cited a potential conflict of interest and transferred it to Judge Watkins down the hall. The clerks were confused. David Kuhn was confused. Zara noted the change but didn't question it. Judges recused themselves for dozens of reasons. It happened. Then Nkechi did something she had never done in her career. She left the bench for the day. She drove to the county records office. She requested sealed adoption files from 40 years ago. She was told it would take weeks. She said, "I'm a judge." They said, "The process is the process, Your Honor." She said, "Then start the process today." 3 weeks later, a file arrived at her chambers. Sealed envelope. She opened it with a letter opener Harold had given June on their anniversary, a brass one with a wooden handle that June had passed to Nkechi after Harold died. Inside was a single page. Twin placement record. Baby A placed with Harold and June Patterson, Franklin. Baby B placed with Colleen Ferris, Briarwood. Baby B, Colleen Ferris, Briarwood. Nkechi called Briarwood Directory Services. There was no Colleen Ferris listed. She searched online. Colleen Ferris, paralegal, deceased 4 years ago, lung cancer. Nkechi sat at her desk in her chambers with the letter opener and the sealed file and the name of a dead woman who had raised her sister, and she felt the floor shift beneath her the same way it had shifted in the courtroom that Tuesday morning. She searched further. Colleen Ferris, survived by one daughter, Zara Ferris, attorney, currently residing in Franklin. Zara Ferris, the quiet woman in the dark suit, the defense attorney with the deep-set eyes and the birthmark on her left wrist, and the voice that sounded like hearing your own thoughts spoken by someone else. Her sister. Now pay attention to what comes next, because this is the part that mattered most. Nkechi didn't rush. She wanted to. Every part of her, the loud part, the arguing part, the part that presented closing arguments from the top of the stairs at age 4, wanted to walk to Zara's office and say, "You're my sister." But she didn't, because Nkechi was a judge. She understood that truth delivered without care is just a different kind of violence. She wrote a letter, by hand, on courthouse stationery which felt too formal, so she threw it away and wrote it again on plain paper from a notebook she bought at the pharmacy on the way home. It took her 4 attempts. The first was too long. The second was too legal. The third was too emotional. The fourth was right. It said, "Dear Zara, my name is Nkechi Okafor. I am a judge in Franklin County. I believe we share something, not a case, but a beginning. I was born on February 14th at Franklin General Hospital, room 309, at 2:17 a.m. I was one of 2. I have a birthmark on the inside of my left wrist. If any of this means something to you, I would like to meet. Not as a judge, as a sister. Nkechi." She mailed it to Zara's office. Then she went home and sat on the porch of the brick duplex and waited. 3 days later, her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. A voice. Quiet. Steady. Deep. "Nkechi?" "Yes." "It's Zara. I got your letter." Silence. The kind of silence that is not empty but full. Full of 40 years and 90 miles and 2 cribs in the same hospital room, and a mother who vanished, and a system that separated what was meant to be together. Zara said, "February 14th, room 309. I have the same birthmark." Nkechi's breath caught. She said, "I know." Zara said, "I didn't know I was a twin." "Colleen, my mother. She never told me." Nkechi said, "June didn't tell me either, not until I asked." Another silence. Then Zara said something that cracked the whole conversation open. She said, "I've been looking for something my whole life. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was a case I hadn't found yet, or an argument I hadn't made yet. But it wasn't that. It was you." Nkechi pressed the phone against her ear so hard it hurt. She said, "Where are you right now?" Zara said, "Standing outside your courtroom, actually. I didn't know if I should come in." Nkechi stood up from the porch. She said, "Don't move." She drove to the courthouse. She parked badly. She walked through the lobby and up the stairs and down the hall to Division 3. And there, standing outside the courtroom doors, was a woman in a dark suit with deep-set eyes and a brown briefcase, and a birthmark on the inside of her left wrist that matched the one on Nkechi's wrist the way a key matches a lock. They stood 10 feet apart, then 8, then 5, then close enough to see that their eyes were the same eyes. Adana's eyes, deep-set, dark, seeing everything. Nkechi said, "Hi." Zara said, "Hi." They looked at each other. 40 years of looking compressed into a single moment. Two women who had been 7 minutes apart at birth and 40 years apart since, standing in a courthouse hallway under fluorescent lights that buzzed softly like the radiator in room 309. Nkechi held out her left hand, wrist up. Zara held out hers. They pressed their wrists together, birthmark to birthmark, and held them there. Nkechi said, "I'm the loud one." Zara said, "I noticed." And Nkechi laughed, a loud, full, room-filling laugh that echoed down the courthouse hallway and made a clerk poke her head out of an office to see what was happening. And Zara laughed too, quieter, deeper, the kind of laugh that starts in the chest and stays there, warm and private and real. They went to a diner, not Barlow's, a different diner. One with vinyl booths and laminated menus and a waitress who called them both Hun. They sat across from each other and they talked for 4 hours. They talked about everything. Nkechi told Zara about Harold and June and the vegetable garden and the grocery store notebook that said law school. Zara told Nkechi about Colleen and Biscuit the cat and the case files on the kitchen table and reading by the light of the stove hood. They discovered things. That they both drank coffee black, that they both read before bed, that they both twisted the same strand of hair when they were thinking. Nkechi the left side, Zara the right, mirror images, like the birthmarks. That they both became lawyers. That they both chose the law not because it was easy, but because it was the closest thing to fairness that humans had built, and both of them wanted to make it closer. Zara said, "I defend people, you judge them." Nkechi said, "We're on opposite sides of the same table." Zara said, "I think that's the point." Nkechi brought Zara home to meet June. On a Sunday afternoon, Zara brought flowers, yellow ones, though she didn't know that was anybody's favorite color, she just liked yellow. She walked into the brick duplex on Orchard Street and saw the vegetable garden and the swing set that was still standing, rusted now, and the refrigerator with Harold's bus company card still magneted to the door. June was in the living room, 88 years old, glasses on the chain, newspaper in her lap. She looked up and saw Zara, and her hands, her always shaking hands, went still, completely still. She said, "Oh, Lord." Zara knelt down beside June's chair. She held out her left wrist. June looked at the birthmark. She reached out and touched it with one trembling finger. She said, "I asked them to let me keep you both. I asked." Zara said, "I know. Nkechi told me." June's face crumpled. 88 years of strength and patience and substitute teaching and raising a child alone and keeping secrets in attic boxes. All of it crumpled. She put her hand on Zara's cheek and said, "You look just like her. Just like Nkechi. Just like her." Zara leaned into that hand, a stranger's hand, an almost mother's hand. She closed her eyes and felt the tremble of those old fingers on her skin, and it felt like coming home to a house she'd never been in but somehow recognized. Nkechi stood in the doorway. She watched her mother touch her sister's face. She watched two pieces of a thing that should never have been separated begin, slowly and gently, to come back together. Her eyes were wet. Her hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped. That evening, the three of them sat at the kitchen table. June made tea.
Nkechi made sandwiches, cut diagonal because June insisted diagonal sandwiches tasted better, a fact that could not be argued with, and Nkechi had stopped trying years ago. Zara sat in Harold's old chair. Nobody said she could. She just sat there, and it fit, and June looked at her in that chair and smiled the way people smile when something lost comes back. They talked about Adana, not with anger, with wonder. Who was she? Where did she go? Why did she leave? They would probably never know. Some questions don't close, they just stay open, like doors, like wounds, like the space between two wrists pressed together in a courthouse hallway. Zara said, "Do you think she's still alive?" Nkechi said, "I don't know." June said quietly, "I think she gave you away because she loved you, not because she didn't." Zara looked at June. She said, "How do you know?" June said, "Because she held you both before she left. The nurse's report said she held you and she whispered something."
A woman who doesn't love her children doesn't hold them. She just goes. Zara's chin trembled. She looked down at the table. She said, "What do you think she whispered?" Nobody answered. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Harold's card hung on the door. The clock on the wall ticked the way clocks tick in houses where time has finally brought something good. Nkechi reached across the table and took Zara's left hand. She turned it over and pressed her thumb against the birthmark and said, "I think she said goodbye. And I think she's been waiting 40 years for us to say hello." Zara held Nkechi's hand. She held it the way she held everything, quietly, completely, with her whole self. And in a brick duplex on Orchard Street, in a kitchen that smelled like tea and bread and the particular warmth of three women who had found each other against impossible odds, the twins who were born 7 minutes apart and raised 90 miles apart and reunited 40 years later, sat at a table and held hands and were, finally, together. June looked at them, her two girls, the one she raised and the one who came back, and she said something so soft it barely left her lips. She said, "Now the table is full." And it was. I hope this story stays with you for a while. Please like, share, and subscribe. Tell us in the comments what you would have done differently. We love reading your thoughts. Until next time.